Councilor Josh Zakem, and we are here today to discuss Docket 0975. It is an ordinance amending the Trust Act. The docket was sponsored by, again, colleague Councilor Josh Zakem, referred to committee back on June 19th of 2019. This ordinance seeks to amend and strengthen the 2014 Trust Act that this body had unanimously passed 5 years ago. The proposed amendment seeks to further clarify the city and department personnel and funds shall not be used to interrogate, detain, and arrest persons solely for immigration enforcement purposes, which are federal responsibilities, including inquiring of an individual's immigration status, detaining someone solely on the basis of civil immigration detainer request, providing personal information regarding a person's release date to ICE solely for the purpose of enforcing civil violations of U.S. immigration laws, making arrests on the basis of ICE administrative warrants, and performing the functions of an immigration officer. Some other amendments include expanding the definition section, adding a new reporting requirement in Section 3, and adding a new Section 4 titled Law Enforcement that specifically outlines what law enforcement officer and/or an employee or city department, agency, or commission shall not do, as well as explicitly outline what the law enforcement official, employee, or city department, agency, or commission is not prevented from doing. I'd like to note that this hearing is being streamlined on Boston City Council TV, online, is being recorded, broadcast on Comcast Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and Verizon 1964. Anyone here that looking to offer public testimony can do so by signing the sheet over in the corner near the chamber entrance, and when we move to public testimony after hearing from our two panels, we'll take as many folks that sign up. I'd also like to turn it over now to my colleague, Councilor Zakem, for an opening statement, and then we'll get right into panel 1, followed by panel 2, and then a discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank everyone for being here this morning, to our folks from BPD and the Walsh administration, and our panelists from the ACLU as well. This, as we've talked about before, has been a collaborative process over the since 5 years, since the Trust Act was initially passed. As Councilor Flaherty said unanimously, that Mayor Walsh signed in 2014. And it's been, I think, a proud distinction for Boston. And given the changing climate, given just time passing, we felt it was necessary to revisit it. And I'm proud of the work we did with Mayor Walsh, with John in particular, and many members of the Boston Police Department command and legal staff to come up with what I think is a step in the right direction, a better, stronger act that more clearly describes what sort of activities both the Boston Police and city employees in general are going to do when it comes to the federal responsibility of immigration enforcement, maintaining trust in our communities, and really making the city a safe place for everyone, regardless of their immigration status. So I don't want to go on too long here, because I know this could be a bit of a technical discussion as well, and I want to make sure we have some time for that. I see John smiling as he recalls our long discussions working out some of the technical points. I do also want to note that this is an open, public, collaborative process. This is a proposed bill. It is a bill that I know we worked very hard to bring to this point, but that is always open for new suggestions, for ideas from members of the community, from either of our panels, or from others. I think it's the goal of certainly myself, and I believe my colleagues on the council, and Mayor Walsh, to come up with a strong, workable, fair version of this law that's going to make sure that everyone in the city of Boston feels that they can engage freely with the police department as victims, as witnesses, or any other city agency. So I look forward to this discussion and look forward to making sure we have a strong bill in place to achieve those goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Zakem. I also just want to read into the record a letter from our colleague, City Council President Andrea Campbell. Dear Chairman Flaherty and colleagues of the Committee on Government Operations, I regrettably cannot attend today's hearing on Docket 0975, the hearing regarding amendments to the Boston Trust Act, due to longstanding commitments elsewhere in the city. As the District 4 City Council, I represent neighborhoods with some of the largest immigrant populations in the city. These neighborhoods also experience heavier policing. Therefore, this hearing about amending the Boston Trust Act, the tool that we've adopted as a city to increase the safety of immigrant residents and build trust between immigrants and law enforcement, is of great importance to me and the residents that I represent. I am grateful to the maker for holding this hearing to help the city improve the Boston Trust Act, and to our public safety officials and residents who choose to testify today. I will be ably represented by a member of my staff at today's hearing, and look forward to reviewing the committee report and working with the community on any recommended next steps. Sincerely, Andrea Campbell, City Council President. And I'm sure we'll be joined by colleagues as they arrive. So with that, I'll turn it right over to the administration. John, I assume that you're going to take the lead. I know that we've also been joined by Superintendent Charles Wilson, Boston Regional Intelligence Center, and also Superintendent Paul Donovan, Bureau of Investigative Services from the BPD. BPD, welcome, gentlemen, and
Thank you.
look forward to hearing your testimony, and you have the floor, John.
Thank you, Counselor. I want to begin by thanking the Chair, Counselor Flaherty, for convening this hearing. And on behalf of Mayor Walsh, I want to specifically thank Counselor Josh Zachem for his work on not one but now two versions of Boston's Trust Act. I want to further recognize the thoughtfulness that you brought to this task, working with Mayor Walsh, the Police Department, and so many other stakeholders. Finally, and again on behalf of the Mayor, I want to thank all the members of the Council who signed on to this important update. Mayor Walsh supports these updates to the Trust Act because, as he said several months ago, it shows our shared values here in the City of Boston, certainly our values between the Council and the Mayor's office. Immigrants are the lifeblood of our country. Boston itself has been and must remain a place of hope and opportunity for generations of immigrants. They're our co-workers, our neighbors, our friends. As Mayor Walsh sees it, and as I'm sure you all agree, there's no us and them, there's only us. In this respect, I think it's safe to say that from the members of the Council to the Mayor, Commissioner Gross, the Police Department, advocates and others, we've all approached this task sharing largely the same goals. It's about building even more trust in our immigrant communities and keeping everyone who lives, works, or visits Boston safe, regardless of immigration status. As Councilor Zachem pointed out several months ago, the updated Trust Act is meant to be a practical policy for our police, and we couldn't agree more. We believe this is a well-crafted and carefully balanced ordinance that doesn't just serve the interest of one community or constituency, but it serves all of us. So we're again grateful for all the hard, thoughtful work that's brought us to this point. We respectfully look forward to seeing this ordinance passed by the Council and signed by Mayor Walsh, and we'll look forward to speaking with you about it today.
Thank you, and either superintendent, if you'd like to add anything.
We agree with that. We think that it's a well thought out act. We support it at the Brick, and just speaking from my bureau, I think it's something that we can deal with, live with, and abide by.
Yeah, any additional, Superintendent Donovan?
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me here today. And yes, Commissioner Gross, the Boston Police Department, we feel that we can certainly work within the letter of the proposed ordinance here.
Right. So how do these amendments, how do they impact sort of the day-to-day operations over at BTD? And do you have any concerns that any of them would have an adverse impact on day-to-day operations?
We follow these guidelines as a matter of course. We're very comfortable with these guidelines. In my former capacity as the commander of the domestic violence unit, we often dealt with victims. We never made it an issue of their immigration status. It was important to us to involve, regardless of their status, victims of domestic violence and treat them as such. I've personally certified many U-Visa applications that came in through these people who are cooperating in police investigations. And we sent out a lot of, we made sure we sent out a lot of literature in different languages through our police advocates who are not non-police officers and our NGO partners to ensure that these people have safe haven with the Boston Police Department. Their immigration status is not a factor.
And then are there any internal policies or safeguards that would prevent any law enforcement officer from acting in violation of this ordinance?
No.
Any
no.
protocols that are not in place now that need to be put in place? And then if to the extent permissible, can you describe the communications currently between the Boston Police Department and ICE officials when they're dealing with detainer requests currently under, say, Section 2? And Section 2 states, a law enforcement official shall not detain an individual solely on the basis of a civil immigration detainer request or an ICE administrative warrant after the individual is eligible for release from custody unless ICE has a criminal warrant issued by a judicial officer for the individual.
That is correct, and that's a long-standing practice. We only involve in criminal matters. We're not concerned with civil matters.
Very good, thank you. We've also been joined by my colleague, City Councilor Anissa Asabi George. Chair recognizes Council Zachem for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the chair's questions were well thought out, and I think I'm pleased to hear that this is, a practical, workable policy. And I also want to reiterate, and I think that sometimes gets lost in the conversation about this, that it's certainly my impression that as a general rule, the Boston Police Department is not working to enforce civil immigration laws. So the fact that, just to hear that again is certainly encouraging, and it just makes sense. It really does. And I think Superintendent Wilson, what you were saying about working with victims, that is, absolutely important. And one of the overarching issues here, and it's not as much in the technical wording of the ordinance or our policies, is the sense, the literal trust, though, that has to be built. And this is not on anyone in the city of Boston. I think a lot of it comes out of Washington, is that people are scared. People are rightfully worried about what's happening on a federal level. And I think it's just important for all of us to keep in mind that even if this is not happening on a regular basis in the city of Boston, we want to make sure everyone here in the city, visitors, residents, regardless of status, knows that that is our policy and knows that they should feel free to come and work with the police, and that we're going to continue doing that. And that is as much the reason for the initial Trust Act and for these updates as well. So I just want to thank you for sharing your views on this and for the collaborative process we had to get here. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Zachem. Chair recognizes Councilor Anissa Asabi-George. I know you're just coming in, but feel free
Thank
to
you.
ask any questions.
I hope this question hasn't been asked. I apologize for coming in late. Can you share with us the communication that may happen between the Boston Police School Police Unit and the sharing of information between those two units and the Boston Public Schools Police Unit?
So we only deal in criminal matters. So there is a vetting process. We make sure that anybody who's making any type of inquiry to us, it's criminal. If it's non-criminal, then we don't adhere to it. We do not release information to anybody who's contacting us on non-criminal matters. So we make sure that we vet the information that comes out of the BRIC. I'm speaking for the BRIC right now, and that we've maintained that practice. So it's been a long-standing practice of ours to make sure that only criminal matters is what counts. We're not interested in any other type of non-criminal activity.
So who are you communicating with, though? In criminal matters, is it the BPD Police Unit, School Police Unit, or is it the BPS School Police Unit?
Typically, it would go through the BPD School Police Unit, commanded by Sergeant Detective Tommy Sexton. I'm not aware, in fairness, and you may not know this, I was appointed to this position a month ago, so I don't have a real long history at the BRIC, but it's my understanding that these matters would be mostly generally conducted by Sergeant Detective Thomas Sexton of the Boston Police School Police Unit.
I think that's fair to say across the department, to the Bureau of Investigative Services also, that any inquiries having to do with the schools involving the Boston Police Department would go through the BPD School Police Unit through Sergeant Detective Sexton, not go directly to the school police themselves. And then Sergeant Sexton would handle that from there.
Who's the final decision maker, though, on information that is shared about any of our students?
It would be the BRIC. I mean, we decide who we disseminate information to, and it is our responsibility to properly vet it, to make sure that we're not releasing information that's going to be used in a non-criminal manner. So as information requests come in, they're properly and appropriately vetted, and as it leaves, we make every attempt to make sure that that information that's requested is requested for criminal investigation.
Are there any questions? And my interest is in protecting our students in the Boston Public Schools in particular,
Yes.
especially those that may not be properly documented,
Yeah.
and protecting them and protecting their sort of status within our schools, and making sure that when our students are in our schools, that they feel safe, and that their status remains not shared if the school community happens to know that status, or if the school police unit, because it's not typically something that the school department collects information on. We don't necessarily know whether a student is documented, but BPD may know because of outside investigation. So I'm really curious and concerned about the sharing of information and what information is shared about our students.
We share your concern, your mission. We're on the same page. We are not interested in a person's immigration status. If somebody in the school police unit contacts us about a certain student and wants to know information about that student relative to information we possess within the brick, as long as that information has to do with a criminal investigation, we'll provide that information. If it does not, we will not.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We've also been joined by City Councilor Ed Flynn. Councilor Flynn, if you have any introductory comments, we're going to move to a different panel. Chair recognizes City Councilor Ed Flynn.
Yeah, thank you, Councilor Flaherty, and to Councilor Zakem, too, for Councilor Zakem's long-term support of our immigrant community in Boston. Just as a way of brief background, I had an opportunity to speak with one issue that I'm focused on is the census, upcoming census, and I've been working with the Chinese Progressive Association. As you know, I represent a large immigrant community in Boston, and the residents of Chinatown expressed to me, they want to make sure their voice is counted in the U.S. Census, but they want to make sure that also that information, the federal information, is not shared with other federal organizations. So I know this has more to do with the law enforcement aspect of it, but it is important to make sure that our immigrant community across our city have trust in our city government, state government, and federal government. And I think under Mayor Walsh and under Councilor Zakem too, in the Boston Police, I think we're heading in the right direction. So I'm glad to be here with members of the Boston Police, the Mayor's administration, and especially residents across the Boston that really support our immigrant community in our city. Thank you, Councilor Flaherty.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. And that will conclude the first panel, so thank you to John Toll, Senior Advisor to Mayor Walsh, to Superintendent Charles Wilson of the BRIC, also known as the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, and also to Superintendent Paul Donovan, Bureau of Investigative Services. We're going to transition to the second panel. You're welcome to stay here, stay in the chamber. You're free to go, whatever whatever suits your fancy. But I know that we have Laura Rotolo here, Staff Counsel and Community Advocate for the ACLU of Massachusetts. So she's previously testified before the council. She's welcome to give an opening comment, and you're welcome to either stay here or you can transition to the chamber and to the gallery. And Laura, if you would like to transition to the middle, you're welcome to do that, whatever's you're most comfortable with. Good morning, Laura. And just state your name and affiliation for the record, and thank you for joining us.
So my name is Laura Rotolo. I am a staff counsel and community advocate at the American Civil Liberties Union. Very happy to be here with you today. Thank you to Mr. Chairman, Councilor Flaherty, Councilor Zakem, Councilor Finn, and Councilor Isabi George for being here today. I want to clarify that although I'm here on behalf of the ACLU, I'm also here on behalf of several dozen organizations and community groups who share the same position that I will explain in a minute. In fact, before I leave here today, I will leave you with a letter signed by 27 community groups, organizations, including 3 labor unions, worker centers, immigration attorneys, the public defender's office, academics, and of course many community groups that work with and on behalf of immigrants in the city. And I want to begin by, of course, commending the City Council for, first of all, the original Trust Act and Councilor Zakem's leadership on that, and for revisiting and for really being open to the community's concerns following the media reports on the case of Mr. Paz Flores, and for revisiting the Trust Act. Every day in Boston, immigrants and their families help the city thrive. And yet every day they face the immediate threat of being torn apart by deportation. In this climate, attacks on immigrants are constant and relentless. The city has vowed to protect and respect the immigrants that make up its thriving economy and culture. And part of that, of course, is strengthening relationships with law enforcement. That goes straight to Councilor Flynn's question about the census. Of course, this ordinance does not deal with the census directly, but indirectly they are tied, they're hand in hand. People will answer the census if they feel that their local and state government can be trusted. It is time to strengthen the Trust Act. Today I want to point out 4 areas in which we believe the Trust Act, the renewed Trust Act, has positive advancements that we stand behind. But I also want to point out 4 areas in which we think there are concerns that threaten to undermine the spirit in which we believe this Trust Act was intended. So the 4 very positive advancements are that, number 1, it spells out that police generally will not ask about immigration status. We've heard that this is the practice day to day, but I can't stress enough how important it is for that to be in writing, for that to be supported by the City Council. It allows us to go back to our communities and say, in no uncertain terms, that if you call 911, if you ask the police for help, you will not be asked about your status. That's a very positive advancement. The second one, that it talks about that the police will not detain immigrants on immigration detainers or on immigration warrants. That, of course, is the state of state law at the moment, but there have been efforts to undermine that law, so it's very important that Boston say that no matter what happens at the state level, Boston police will not be holding people on immigration detainers. Third point is that it does say that the police will not sign 287G agreements, these very extreme agreements in which you take a local person, you deputize them, you give them federal powers to act as ICE agents. We consider that to be the most drastic form of collaboration with ICE, and we thank the council and the police department for committing not to sign those agreements. And lastly, the police have said that they will not be transferring individuals to ICE custody, which we also believe is important to have in writing, even if it is standard practice, to ensure that we can tell people that when they are released from Boston Police, they will not be immediately transferred to ICE custody. Those are the areas that we can support wholeheartedly, and we thank the council for. But I want to point out 4 areas of significant concern, and I thank the councilors for being open to our suggestions. I will also give you today some language that we are suggesting to address these 4 issues. The first issue is an ongoing lack of transparency. As we sit here today, we do not know the full extent of cooperation between ICE and the Boston Police Department. Advocates for years have tried to get even public records. There's a lawsuit pending about public records relating to the gang database. And we still do not have the full extent of even those public records. And I would say that some of the questions also have not been answered completely. I will remind us all that it was only through the Department of Labor's lawsuit and the media accounts of the Paz Flores case that we even learned about the existence of a BPD ICE task force. Advocates did not know about the existence of this task force. We believe it contradicts the spirit of the original Trust Act as well, and we'd need to know more. That transparency can be built into this ordinance by requiring the BPD to regularly report about the task forces that it's a part of, the databases that it shares, the information that is shared with ICE on a regular basis with this council. So lack of transparency sort of is underneath all of this. The second concern is that the language does not actually address what happened in the Paz Flores case. And just as a reminder, there was one police officer who shared information with ICE and allowed ICE to arrest a person, basically set up almost a sting operation where they told ICE where this person was going to be under a ruse that he was going to be paid by his employer, and set up so that ICE could actually arrest him. And you will hear more about that during the public comment period. The language here does not address that issue. That situation could happen once again with the language as currently written. And so we believe that is a significant concern. The third issue is that Section 4B has 4 exceptions to the general rule that police will not ask about immigration status and will not generally enforce immigration laws. And I'll just take them very quickly because I have more details in our letter to you. But the first one, 4B1, would allow police to investigate and enforce federal law about reentry to the United States. The statute that is cited there is about what happens when a person has been deported from the country and is caught reentering. When advocates read that language, there were literal shockwaves. We do not understand why the police would want to be enforcing federal law, why, as the language states, they would be detaining and investigating people about this federal statute. We did not know that the police were doing this. We hope that they're not doing it, and we think that this language is very harmful. The idea that the Boston Police would spend its time and its resources investigating and detaining people for federal reentry is very problematic and really threatens to undermine the trust of the community. Section 4B says that the police can share query information with ICE. ICE is able to get query information through the state registry, through CJIS. There is no reason why the Boston Police Department would need to share query information, protected information with ICE. And we think that that language should be struck. Because again, it undermines the trust that we're trying to build here. If we say we're going to be sharing your protected information with ICE when it can be gotten in a different way. Part 4B3 relates to task forces, which I have previously mentioned are really lacking in transparency. This language is vague and allows the Boston Police to continue to be part of these task forces for very broad purposes, including civil matters. And we believe that language should be narrowed so that we know the task forces that the police are a part of and we can ensure that they really are focused on sort of criminal behavior or major crimes and not a civil matter. Section B4 relates to T&U visas, which are visas that trafficking victims and survivors of domestic violence can apply for. They require a certification from the police or law enforcement that the person has been cooperating with the law enforcement entity. And we thank the police for putting in here that they will in fact sign these certifications. However, we want to make sure that they are not asking individuals about their immigration status when they sign those. And this language does allow making inquiries into information necessary for that certification. We just want to make sure that those inquiries do not include immigration status. And I believe the department has already testified to the fact that they would not be asking that information because it sends a chilling effect. Victims will not come forward. And in fact, you will hear later, hopefully during the public comment period, about why that information is absolutely not necessary. The police does not need to know your status in order to sign one of those certifications. So those are the 4 exceptions that we would hope that the City Council would be able to narrow. And then lastly, our last concern is about information sharing with ICE. To Councilor Isabi George's question about the schools, this language does not prevent information sharing in civil matters. I would contradict what the department said today. It is not only about criminal matters. We know from practice, and you will hear hopefully again during the public comment period, from practitioners who have clients who have been deported based on information from the Boston Public Schools and from the BRIC. The gang database, the CopLink database, we don't know what other databases are out there, but we know that ICE sits in these rooms with the Boston Police and receives information. Either passively or actively, people are getting deported based on information from the Boston Police Department. And the language here, we have an opportunity to add language into the ordinance that would limit that kind of information sharing to maybe criminal matters or however is appropriate to limit it. But it absolutely should not be shared from the Boston Police, from the schools to ICE on civil immigration matters. That's the extent of my comments, and I really look forward to working with the committee and the 26 of us plus, really look forward to working with you on really strengthening this Trust Act that will have such an impact really across the state because of of the way, Boston is built on immigrant work and sweat and labor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. Just a couple questions from the chair. What are other cities in Massachusetts doing to prevent their local officials from acting as or on behalf of ICE? What are you seeing across the state?
We are seeing ordinances, resolutions, mayoral acclamations to this effect in about 50 cities currently, cities and towns across the state. And they range everywhere from, what our 2014 Trust Act looked like to what this looks like today and beyond. City councils and town governments are taking it upon themselves to ensure that they protect their immigrants by, focusing on law enforcement.
And then, given the federal climate, what trends is the ACLU seeing in immigration arrests and deportations?
Certainly, immigration arrests have, I think they more than tripled within the first year of this administration. We are seeing arrests and deportations increase. Of course, we're seeing denials of asylum seekers and other forms of relief that had not been denied in the past. And so it's getting more and more difficult to come here to the United States legally, and we're seeing deportations of record numbers of people.
And then what is ACLU's position on sort of the joint investigations, the joint task force? In some instances, local, state, and federal authorities have to work with one another for obvious reasons. So what is the position of joint task force, joint investigations, sharing of information in order to protect the public, particularly if information has come known? I mean, Boston arguably was the launching pad for September 11th. We also were home to the marathon bombing. Pretty egregious and horrific acts that were conducted and started arguably right here in the city. So it's important for our law enforcement officials, Boston, state, local, and federal, to work together and to collaborate. So just want to make sure that whatever we're doing here does not prevent their ability to work with one another.
Absolutely, and I think just two things to that. Number one, we would just say increase transparency. We want to make sure that the public knows what kind of cooperation is happening to the extent that there are task forces, more transparency about what those task forces are, who's on them, and what they do. And secondly, to really make sure that we limit the information sharing and the cooperation in those task forces to criminal matters only, and that we don't use those to help deport our friends and neighbors.
Very good. Councilor Zachem.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Laura, for your testimony today, for your partnership going back 5 years with this coalition in my first term and now in my final term, trying to fix this or make it better, I should say. I thank you, and I know you said you're going to provide the written comments to the committee, which will be helpful as we make sure to have a strong final version of this bill. I appreciate it, hearing the practical impacts and some of the concerns from you, your coalition, and clients and the folks that you work with is important, because it's one thing to write legislation in this building, and another to hear how it's going to impact day to day. And I certainly want to make sure whatever the final language of this is doing what we intend. So, I don't want to go line by line and in the weeds right now. I think if the chair determines that that's appropriate at a working session at some point, that's the venue for that. But I will say, particularly with your first comment on Section 4B1 around police enforcing any federal immigration laws, I think that's certainly something will inquire with the prior panel about removing that. I think that's an important first step. But again, I don't want to go line by line in this forum, but I certainly welcome that discussion and that cooperation. I think we need to do it. You made a very important point about state law already sort of following our original Trust Act, and it's critical that, as important as I think this law can be day to day, it also is a symbol. It also has power in discourse across the Commonwealth. We're the largest city. People look to Boston, and we have challenges at the state level. around this. So I also think that's incredibly important, and I want to make sure we are leading on that, and I look forward to hearing comments from, I think, probably many of the people behind you, and I know we received some written comments about this as well. But there are shared goals here, and the shared goals of both the Walsh administration, I think certainly our colleagues here on the council, your organization, your coalition, to do this thoughtfully. So I thank you for that. You've really already shared, I think, in your testimony very succinctly what your concerns are for this. I don't have, I think, detailed questions on that. I will just assure you that those are, well taken, certainly by me. I expect by my colleagues. I don't want to speak for anyone else. And we'll continue to review that and to work on that because this does have to work. I don't think any of us are in the habit of working on legislation that's not going to have the desired impact. And to Councilor the Chair's point about task forces around terrorism, around drug trafficking, around gangs, absolutely that's something that nobody on this body wants to prevent. But your point about transparency is very important in all areas of government, but particularly in this. And there is a delicate balance, and I think this body does have a responsibility, an oversight responsibility of all city departments, not just to single out the Boston Police Department, but of all city departments, that we are acting in accordance with our values, that we're acting in accordance with the spirit also of these laws, not just the letter. And I certainly intend to continue doing that. So I don't want to suck up all the air in the room going on about the goals of this once again, but really thank you for this partnership. I look forward to continued work together.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Chirigan.
I don't have any other questions. Thank
Councilor
you.
Flynn, any final comments before we transition
Thank
to
you.
public testimony?
Yeah, thank you, Council Flaherty. I have just two points or questions for Laura. On B4 that you highlighted as it relates to domestic violence, I have the opportunity I'm working with Council President Andrea Campbell on domestic violence programs, and we're going to have a hearing soon. I visited the Asian Task Force Against Domestic Violence recently, have spoken to them many times. The number one issue they have is language access, and the second issue is people are afraid to come forward because of their immigration status. So as it relates to B4, what can we do to be helpful as it relates to domestic violence victims, making sure that their privacy is protected, and their status is protected, and that they are able to get the services that they need, even though a police officer may be in the room eventually, but is there anything that we can do specifically to strengthen that?
Absolutely, and thank you for that question. Certainly, survivors of domestic violence are a population that is key to this whole effort. And firstly, I would just say to clarify that section B4, that whatever inquiries are made do not include inquiries about status.
Okay.
Because they're unnecessary and they have a chilling impact. So just that first clause, making inquiries into information necessary to certify, to ensure that that does not include immigration status. And of course, I would look forward to your upcoming hearing about proactive ways in which the police can continue to build those relationships to ensure that victims and survivors are coming forward.
That's very helpful, thank you. And my second point is on October 1st, actually, I'm working with Chinese Progressive Association as we were talking about the 2020 census. It's the 6-month kickoff to the census. We're having an event in Chinatown with various neighborhood organizations, including many in Chinatown, some in South Boston, others that are part of BHA task force as well. But I am concerned with how the process will be as it relates to the census, making sure that our immigrant community does count, that they're confident that when they give information to a Census Bureau person, that won't be shared with any other federal agency. but it does take a lot of education and training prior to that to make sure that the message gets out there that when you do participate in the census, that information will not be shared with anyone. Do you have any comments or thoughts about how we can continue working to educate people in our immigrant community about the importance of the census?
Yes, certainly. Many of the groups behind me are part of the coalition to ensure that everyone is counted in Massachusetts, and we have been working with the Chinese Progressive Association and others to do that education work. Number one, to say that the law does prohibit the sharing of census information with other agencies, and to be clear about that. And then number two, to ensure people that the Supreme Court did not allow the citizenship question to go forward, because there were so many questions around that. Would the citizenship question be there? And would that have a chilling impact? So we've been doing a great deal of education around that, you know, and with the kickoff coming up, and we would continue to have the City Council's official help on that, to really get the word out to people that it's safe to answer the census, and that we need you to answer so that you can be counted, so that you can get the resources and the federal money and the representation that you deserve. So I thank the councilor for his work on that.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess my final point, maybe I should ask either Councilor Flaherty or Zachem, but maybe you might want to weigh in. I know you talked about work, sweat, and labor of our immigrant community. We often see strikes, picket lines, lockouts in this city. What impact would it have, or does any of the provisions in here address someone that may be arrested on a picket line, or information is obtained during a lockout or a strike? Is that information shared with any law enforcement authorities that we know of, if they are an immigrant? And the reason I ask is, like many of my colleagues, we're often on picket lines and we talk to a lot of the workers, and as you said, they work hard and they make our city the city that it is, but I would never want to see that type of information from someone on a picket line be shared with anybody. Does any of this address those concerns?
I will allow my colleagues from the labor unions who are here today, including SEIU 32BJ, to talk more extensively about that, but just to say that we want to ensure that people can exercise their rights. And part of that is making sure that, you know, if you are in a situation where you're going to be arrested, that information won't lead to deportation. So that part of the Trust Act is this information sharing that we want to be able to limit. So if you are in a situation where you're going to be arrested on a picket line or whatever, for whatever reason, we want to make sure we know what information is going to ICE so that we can advise people appropriately.
Yeah, someone that's on a picket line expressing their constitutional rights for fair wages or being treated fairly, treated with respect, I would never want to see that information passed to anybody. So maybe during a working session, that's something we can continue to work on. Thank you for taking my questions.
Thank
Thank you,
Councilor.
Councilor Flaherty.
Thank you, Councilor, and thank you, Laura, for participating today. I appreciate your time and attention. Look forward to working with you. And also, that'll conclude the second panel. We're going to go to transition of public testimony. You're welcome to stay as well to listen to public testimony. So if there's any folks wishing to offer public testimony, I have a couple sheets here. We're going to continue to take signatures, so just ask folks to come in. You can alternate. We have two sets of microphones, one to the left, one to the right. So Wendy Wayne, if you could make your way down to this podium, and Halosha Galvaro, she can come to this one. Welcome. State your name and affiliation for the record.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you to City Council members for having this hearing, for allowing me to speak. My name is Wendy Wayne. I'm the director of the Immigration Impact Unit at the Committee for Public Counsel Services, also known as CPCS. You probably know that CPCS is the statewide public defender's office responsible for providing court-appointed counsel to all individuals, indigent individuals who have a state-recognized right to counsel. So we represent people not only in criminal criminal cases, but in juvenile, children and family law, and mental health cases as well. My unit advises those attorneys who have immigrant clients on the immigration consequences of their cases. I'd like to reiterate the points made by Laura Rotolo earlier of some of the points that she made about this revised Trust Act. The Act strengthens in some areas the general understanding that Boston police will not ask about immigration status, and that is as Laura Rotolo stated earlier, that is a very important and significant point and will have, I think, significant impact for the immigrant community, or use resources to enforce civil immigration law. And it clarifies that police may not hold individuals on civil immigration detainers. These are important provisions that will help to increase trust in immigrant communities. However, some of the other provisions, I believe, undermine that goal and could be detrimental not only to community members, but also to the Boston Police. And I'd like to address two issues briefly in particular. First, the revised Trust Act does not address the sharing of information with ICE from the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, known as BRIC. The database, as you are probably well aware, includes observations, perceptions, and often vague opinions about individuals who may or may not be gang-related. It includes rumors and hearsay that individual officers have heard that may turn out to be false, but nonetheless remain indefinitely in this database. The documents from BRIC often have a disclaimer on the bottom, it's my understanding, that the information does not constitute probable cause, that it is information meant only for officer safety and awareness. In fact, the SJC, the state Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, the state Supreme Court, recently commented on testimony that was based on information from the BRIC database and found that testimony of a so-called gang expert that a murder defendant was gang-related based on information from the BRIC database was so unreliable that it was one of the grounds that warranted reversal of this murder conviction. Although information from the BRIC database cannot be used in criminal prosecutions because it does not have a sufficient level of reliability and it's often hearsay, it is regularly shared with ICE and used in immigration proceedings in very significant ways to deny bond to people so that people are not released during the pendency of their removal proceedings, and often results in negative discretionary decisions which result in deportation of people who would otherwise be eligible for lawful status in the U.S. I believe the Trust Act should include an amendment preventing the sharing of information from this database with ICE. The second issue that I would like to address is a more general one about some of the exceptions that have already been talked about listed in 4B of the proposed act. As already stated, some of these exceptions I worry may result in sort of swallowing the intent of the act, that the exceptions threaten to swallow the rule, that Boston law enforcement should not be involved in civil immigration enforcement, especially the exceptions which continue to allow information sharing and joint investigations that include not only criminal prosecutions or criminal investigations, but also include some civil immigration enforcement, and specific provisions that discuss police, as we've already talked about, arresting individuals on federal criminal immigration offenses. This will continue both the reality and the perception that Boston police are somehow facilitating and involved in immigration enforcement, which goes against the intent of this revised act. I would like to urge the council to reconsider those exceptions. Information sharing and joint task forces that include civil immigration enforcement have dual purposes and cause, I believe, a sort of diluted focus by Boston police on their main purpose, which should be their only purpose, in keeping the Boston community safe and investigating and prosecuting local and state crimes. And we have seen examples in the last couple years as to what happens when civil immigration enforcement invades our criminal justice system. When ICE, in the last 2 years, as has been well reported, ICE has been routinely stalking the Massachusetts courthouses, arresting people as they're coming and going from the Massachusetts courthouses, inside the courtrooms, inside the hallways. It has prevented immigrant defendants, victims, and witnesses from attending court. And it's well recognized at this point that civil immigration enforcement within Massachusetts courthouses severely impacts both the functioning of the court and access to the court and the criminal justice system as a whole. Similarly, I fear that when Boston police are sharing information and participating in joint investigations that result in civil immigration enforcement, any more than is required by law, this not only erodes trust in the community, but it also creates certain expectations by ICE that Boston police may do their bidding when it comes to civil immigration enforcement. And we've seen that when those expectations are not met, that this has resulted in federal criminal prosecution against court officials who were involved in their roles within the courthouse. It's created those pending federal indictments have created tremendous fear from all of those involved in the criminal justice system, not only defense attorneys, judges, court officers, prosecutors, who worry that in the process of doing their job and doing what is required by them, that it will somehow be perceived by ICE officials who are hoping for assistance in a particular case, that they are somehow obstructing ICE's ability to do their civil immigration enforcement. And I believe that when Boston police are involved any more than necessary in information sharing, investigations, or anything that involves civil immigration enforcement, that could create the same expectations and create the same risk to Boston law enforcement, that they could be seen as somehow impeding or obstructing civil immigration enforcement in the future if they should decide in a particular case they don't want to share certain information or they don't want to participate in an investigation because the true purpose is not criminal, it's more civil immigration enforcement. And so for those reasons, I believe that the exceptions in 4B will undermine the intent of the revised act and will also create an unnecessary risk for law enforcement officials in Boston. And for those reasons, I would ask you to reconsider those amendments. And I thank you again for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.
Helosha Galvo, followed by Kerry Doyle.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you for listening to our concerns. My name is Eloisa. I am a co-founder and the director of the Brazilian Women's Group. We are located in Brighton. I am a Boston resident. I am a proud resident of Jamaica Plan, and I have worked as a bilingual field coordinator for 20 years for Boston Public Schools. I'm no longer with PPS, but I worked for 20 years doing school registration for Portuguese-speaking families. I'm not going to repeat what people have said before me. I am here to talk about two issues, fear and the census. I'm very concerned with my community, the Brazilian community in Boston, because people are so fearful. And the narrative put forward by the Flores case is that the Boston police turned to immigration a worker, victim of labor violation. That's the narrative that people heard, and it is still out there because we don't have a clear answer. And I am worried because at the Brazilian Women's Group, we do not work with domestic violence. We don't have a project to help women or other victims of domestic violence, but we are seeing an increase in the number of domestic violence. We receive 2 to 3 calls every week on domestic violence, and we refer them to programs like Massachusetts Alliance of Portuguese Speakers and others that we know that have Portuguese-speaking people trained. But I'm raising this because fear does not allow these women or other victims to report to the police. They are not going to court. They call us because they are so afraid to go to court. The other day, the woman was freaking out because by mistake she got request for jury duty. She didn't qualify for jury duty, but she just freaked out that she had that paper in front of her and she had to go to the authorities. So the other thing that I want to say is about the census that you raised. How can I go back to my community and ask people to fill out a form, or open the door to an enumerator, or answer a call from someone they don't know in this climate? So I'm here, I want to be short, I'm here to tell you, put yourself, please, in this family shoes. Look at your heart and listen to what my colleague Laura Rotoli said. Take into consideration the concern that we raised in our letter. These families coming to Boston now, we have many families coming. It's huge, the number. In Boston Public Schools, I've seen a lot of kids coming to school registration. These kids are traumatized. Most of them crossed the border. Most of them were separated from the family. They're so scared. They need to feel safe at school. They need to feel safe at home. I have to be able to tell them, you are safe at school, you are safe at the street, you are safe to go to a store, you are safe to go to a movie theater. But I can't say that, or I can say that, but they are not going to hear or believe me if the narrative in the newspaper, the narrative out there in Boston is that the Boston police work with immigration. So please, take into consideration what we said. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Heloisa. Carrie Doyle will be followed by Amy Grunder, who will be followed by Elizabeth Badger, who will be followed by Audrey Richardson. Welcome.
Hi,
Thank
good
you.
morning. Thank you, Chairman Flaherty, Councilor Asahi George, Flynn, and especially Councilor Zakem for your leadership in the Boston Trust Act and for your willingness to make some amendments. My name is Carrie Doyle. I'm an immigration attorney. I'm in private practice currently. I've been practicing for 26 years. I came from the nonprofit world, and considering we specialize in complex cases and working with low-income communities, some would say I'm still in the nonprofit world. There are a couple items I want to highlight that I'm concerned about. And one thing I do want to mention is Mr. Paz Flores was really just one example of the kind of things that happen on a daily basis with ICE, in that they become a tool almost of terror to the immigrant community. And I think it's important that the BPD is aware of that and is careful. And you heard about, as Councilor Flynn was mentioning, in particular domestic violence survivors and other individuals. But I've had clients I had a client who was being extorted by someone we believe might be a confidential informant with ICE, and he was turned into ICE, detained and deported from his permanent resident spouse and citizen children. I'm a resident of Boston. My business is in Boston. I'm particularly concerned with the BRIC and the sharing of the information out of the BRIC. I have a young man now. He's not from Boston, he's from Chelsea, but it's a parallel. It happens exactly the same way out of East Boston High School in particular, where information from the BRIC has been used against him. He's eligible for a green card. The immigration judge has actually granted him a green card, and yet because it's on appeal, he's actually been detained for over 2 years, 2.5 years by ICE. He's on suicide watch currently. It's really at the Plymouth County House of Correction. He was just moved to Bristol County House of Correction. But all of that is as a result of the BRIC and of information sharing from the BRIC. He has no juvenile convictions, certainly no adult convictions whatsoever. And the judges, immigration judges, are taking information from the BRIC and using that to deny bond and to deny relief. Now, in our case, we won both bond and relief from the immigration judge, despite the negative information from the BRIC. I was concerned by the information saying that the information from the BRIC is only shared in, quote, criminal matters. So what does that mean exactly? And I think it's very important in the amended act to define specifically what criminal matters mean. So does that mean when the ICE comes to the BRIC and says we need information on Jose Ramos, and they say, oh yeah, we've had some interaction with them in the BRIC, that they just hand over all those documents? I've got BRIC documents from a number of individuals, both in Boston and out in this case, that were handed over to ICE and are used as a tool against the young men who may be mentioned in those in the BRIC the database. And to understand also that even the BRIC database, the the standard to put information in there is not being followed. So there's information going into the brick that shouldn't be going into the brick. And we've worked with some experts and others that have testified to this at immigration court, but really the problem is at its source, which is the brick itself. And that information is going to the brick that shouldn't even be in the brick. And then the information even that should be in the brick is all very unreliable. And as Ms. Wayne mentioned, that, and Laura Rotula mentioned, that the Supreme Judicial Court has said that this information is unreliable. And in fact, Boston BPD does not use information from the brick in pursuing criminal charges against individuals because it is so unreliable. But because this information is shared with ICE, it's really having an unbelievable impact, very negative impact on some of the youth in our community. And I know a number of individuals that rather than be detained, I mean, my client's unusual in that he's willing to stay detained for so long to fight for his right to stay here. But I know a number of young people that have given up and accepted a deportation order instead of fighting against it. And all of that is relying on the brick. And that information is coming from schools. And the whether it's a school resource officer or the principals, they're being shared, that information is being put in the brick. Any interactions with the police, even if they're not criminal in nature, are being put in the brick, and that information is 100% being used against individuals in order to deport them. And remember that immigration is civil, is completely civil. It's not a criminal matter whatsoever. And so to me, I think it's very, very important that there be stricter guidelines for sharing of brick information with ICE, that if we're talking about criminal issues, I think there has to be very strict guidelines on what criminal really means. And it can't just be ICE coming to them and saying, oh, you know, this kid's a trouble, he's in a gang, or this kid. And because they've used the fact that there are very few limits on immigration. You know, you don't have the same constitutional rights with immigration that you do with BPD. So there's someone that maybe ICE can arrest that BPD can't arrest, for example, and they'll use ICE, they'll use immigration, you know, as a tool, and it goes both ways. And so I'm very concerned about the brick sharing. And the truth is, what Councillor Flynn was asking about what can he do, what can the council do. And honestly, as was mentioned, I mean, the narrative in the community is that BPD cooperates with ICE. It is because of what happened to Mr. Puzzflores. People know. The community is a grapevine. Like, people hear, and it's rumors too. But the most important thing that the City Council and the Boston as a community, that the mayor and that the City Council can do is to stand up and actually not just say we're a welcoming community for immigrants. I mean, we're an immigrant city. We're a majority minority city. We need to step up and we need to set an example for the rest of the Commonwealth and for the country, I believe. And that your actions to stand up and say we are taking very specific actions, not just words, but actions to protect immigrants in our community. And as the community members see that they're being protected, see that BPD really is on their side and not on ICE's side, and that is not the current narrative, I think you will see, a shift in understanding in the community. People in Councillor Flynn's district, for example, in the Chinese American community, will be more willing to come forward and make complaints. People in other immigrant communities will be more willing to come forward and make complaints. But the brick sharing information, and I would agree, just the reentry, the being specifically willing to enforce reentry is really problematic. I have a number of cases, and I won't go on, but of individuals that have reentered in part because their rights were violated initially. So it's not so cut and dry. Like, don't believe just because someone reentered they're some terrible criminal, because the stories are as complex as you can imagine, and that in order for us to have a safe, welcoming, successful community, people need to feel safe and protected. And I would say that at this moment that's not true, and we are fighting the federal narrative, which is very negative. But I think anything Boston can do and the council can do to really lay out specific information to protect kids in their schools, which they don't feel protected right now, to protect kids here that need help, that need support, that can have a future. I think the actions will speak louder than your words, and that we can really have a safe and welcoming community and a successful city. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Carrie. Welcome.
Thank you very much. My name is Amy Grunder, and I direct legislative affairs for the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, representing over 130 organizations providing advocacy and services for over 1 million immigrant state residents. I want to thank all three of you, Councilors Flaherty and Zakem and S.A.B. George, I hope I pronounced your name right, for the opportunity to testify today. So we, like the other speakers today, we really applaud the efforts of Councilor Zakem and the Boston City Council to amend the 2014 Trust Act in this new era of really terrifying, no-holds-barred immigration enforcement. These efforts are more critical than ever in restoring confidence in our public officials, not just police, but especially the police. We do share the view that these amendments are necessary in light of the Supreme Judicial Court's 2017 Lund decision. That ruling largely supersedes the 2014 Trust Act. And as other speakers have said, we particularly welcome the several new protections for immigrant city residents, such as limiting questions about immigration status, super important, and generally prohibiting the use of city resources to enforce federal immigration laws. But that said, again, the language as currently drafted creates a number of loopholes and exceptions that, in our view, undermines these protections, in some cases severely. So of particular concern for us, first, the proposed ordinance does not prevent police from sharing information with ICE about a person's pending release from custody. As drafted now, it only prohibits police from affirmatively offering such information. It continues to allow such information sharing in response to an ICE request, which is typically the trigger for such information sharing. So that's one. That's in 4A1C. Second, the ordinance would not prohibit police from notifying ICE of the whereabouts of someone who is not in custody for the purpose of making a civil immigration arrest. This leaves open the possibility for the kind of abuse that we saw in the Flores case and undermines trust between immigrant communities and the BPD. Remember, he was not in custody, nor was he ever charged with a crime, I believe. Third, the ordinance would permit police to question and arrest people on mere suspicion that they have violated federal immigration laws that criminalize reentry after deportation. If such people are detected during, during an unrelated Boston police activity, which could include something as simple as a traffic stop. This provision undermines the prohibition in the ordinance on asking questions about immigration status, creating the possibility of investigation and arrest on the pretext that a person appears to have re-entered the country illegally. These are just a few examples, and there's a more complete list in the joint letter that Attorney Rotolo is submitting on all of our behalfs today. But we strongly encourage the committee to work with the very many talented advocates in this room to address these and other concerns, and especially as one of the first cities to enact a Trust Act in Massachusetts, Boston has an opportunity to again be a real standard bearer for the rest of the state. And in our view, it's critical that this opportunity be embraced to avoid enacting protections that are more symbolic than real. We think that's really important. And thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Very good. Thank you for your testimony. Elizabeth Badger, Audrey Richardson, Gabrielle Camacho.
Good morning, Council. I'll be brief. Elizabeth Badger. I'm a senior attorney at the PAIR Project. I've worked as an immigration advocate for about 15 years. In my current role, I work primarily with families, youth, and victims of crimes. I wanted to address the questions briefly about the provision 4B4, about the U visa and T visa applications. Just to be clear, so U visa applications is a type of protection for victims of crimes, T visas for victims of trafficking. Both types of applications have a process whereby a law enforcement agent or it could be a prosecutor is signing in a certification that the individual was assisting or cooperating in the investigation or prosecution of the crime or the trafficking. That's the only assessment, whether the assistance or cooperation has occurred, that is being asked on that application or that certification. And so the question of whether an individual is undocumented or what their status is really irrelevant. And our fear, our concern is that by having a provision stating that LEAs may ask about immigration status, that messages to LEAs that it is permissible to ask about immigration status, and our position is simply that it's not. It's not relevant. That determination is made by the immigration agency, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, when an application and that certification is submitted to them. It would create a chilling effect. The chilling effect has already started, but it would further the chilling effect of victims coming forward and asking for police protection, which is the point of the U&T visa application. I want to mention just one further comment as well about Councilor George's question to the earlier panel about information sharing with ICE. I know my colleagues have spoken about it, but I think one thing that is not clear is when the gentleman said that BRIC decides what information to share with ICE. I don't, in my experience, and as my colleagues have testified, there have been experts, more expert than I am on this, that have said that it's not so much that BRIC decides. There are databases that are shared. And so I work a lot with youth, and a lot of youth in East Boston, where we've seen a number of information sharing, whether it's from the Boston Public School Police or whether it's from the Boston Police Department in the schools. It's unclear. The point is that the information sharing is happening. It's not always about criminal charges. We know that there are FIOs that are being made in the schools or outside the schools by individuals that, as far as we know, are either BPD in the school or Boston Public School Police, and they don't allege criminal conduct. So why they are being entered into databases at all is unclear, because there are regulations about the nature of the FIOs needing to allege criminal conduct. But that information is obtained by ICE. We get it when we're in immigration court defending our clients. So because we don't understand how it's being shared, there are no rules. You ask different people and you get different answers. The Trust Act is the opportunity to clarify that and lay groundwork and get everyone on the same page. And I would, encourage the city and the city council to stop that information sharing until we have a better understanding of how it's working. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, Audrey.
Good morning. My name is Audrey Richardson. I'm a senior attorney at Greater Boston Legal Services. And I have two points of involvement here. I both work broadly with and support the various community immigrant-based worker centers that make up the Immigrant Worker Center Collaborative. I also represent, as a lawyer, Martin Paz Flores in his role as a witness in the U.S. Department of Labor's retaliation case. In that capacity, I've been in close contact with his immigration lawyer, his workers' compensation lawyer, the lawyers at the U.S. Department of Labor, and have had complete access to the information about that case, including complete access to all of his criminal history records, his CORI, his FBI records, et cetera. And we're not here to rehash what happened in that case today, except that I do want to mention that that was truly a situation, as you've heard before, where the Boston Police provided information to ICE for immigration enforcement purposes, and in a way that really facilitated the retaliatory behavior of an employer against a badly injured employee who had reported an injury, initiated an OSHA complaint, and filed a workers' compensation claim. And I don't think it's crystal clear, as laid out in the U.S. Department of Labor's complaint in that case, based on the information that they were able to obtain, that the police clearly connected all the dots and facilitated Mr. Paz Flores' arrest by ICE. And there really was not the slightest justification for that. In the hearing that was held back in April, the representatives of the BPD they said that there were identity issues. They alluded to his quarry that they couldn't share in order to protect his privacy. And as I said back then, I've seen all of that. There is nothing there that provided the slightest justification for anything. The criminal charges, apart from a very minor motor vehicle matter, had been 13 to 15 years ago in Florida and were all dismissed. There was nothing there. So I need to emphasize and to reiterate the points that have already been made about the Boston Police's ability to decide when they are going to play this kind of role in civil immigration enforcement, when they are going to share information, and what steps they are going to take, because it makes it very clear that there need to be very strong safeguards put into place and protections to not give the police unfettered discretion here to make these decisions. And that it really can only take place under the circumstances and specific circumstances where there are real and serious criminal issues to provide a real and serious threat to public safety and security. Because, this is one case that came to light, but it really indicates that we need to have this laid out. And as you've heard, nothing in this current proposal would have prevented this from happening again. And I would strongly urge you to consider the ways in which the proposal can really be tightened and strengthened to really delineate when and where the Boston Police can share information and play this kind of role. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gabriel Camacho, Milagros Barreto, Michael Felson, and Leslie. We've also been joined by my colleague, City Council Lydia Redwoods. Welcome.
Good morning, Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Gabriel Camacho. I'm the Immigrant Rights Coordinator for the American Friends Service Committee. The AFSC is a Nobel Peace Laureate and just celebrated its centennial last year. It was 5 years ago that many of us here, and many more who could not be here today, especially immigrant workers, packed this chamber for hours and testified in favor of the Boston Trust Act. The comments and questions from the council were supportive. That night, we left City Hall confident that the Boston City Council would do the right thing. And you did. Thank you, Councilman Zakem, for your leadership and advocacy. As you know, we now face a far more dangerous political climate for immigrants and people of color. This is why we oppose the 4 proposed amendments that were mentioned by Attorney Rotolo, and that would betray the spirit of the original Trust Act. Some of the proposed amendments would make the revised Trust Act extremely harmful for immigrant communities and relationships between the communities and the Boston Police Department. We are here today because Mr. Paz Flores, an immigrant worker, was a victim of collusion between an unscrupulous employer, a Boston police officer who for no good legal or official reason contacted Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Instead of addressing the serious issues raised by the Flores case, including violations of due process and labor rights, and the subsequent lack of transparency and accountability, the proposed amendments would further erode community relations with the Boston Police Department. In particular, why would the Boston Police Department take it upon themselves to investigate enforced reentry, which is a federal issue? We have submitted this morning 4 modifications that would strengthen the Trust Act and begin to repair the community and police relations that have been damaged by the Flores case. Our amendments would honor Mayor Walsh's promise that his administration would protect the rights of immigrant communities. He even said at a press conference that he would make City Hall a sanctuary if there was a Trump raid. Let's get back to that. Now, you have a simple choice today, or when you deliberate. Either become part of this massive deportation machinery, or represent your community and do the right thing as you did in 2014. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity again. My name is Milagros Barreto. I'm the Worker Center Director of MASCOS, which is the Massachusetts Coalition for Health and Safety, for Occupational for Health and Safety. Also representing the IWC, which is the Immigrant Worker Collaboration. I'm here to make echo about all what you just heard during this morning. We also believe that there's concerns about this new ordinance language. And we believe also that still would have no prevent what happened to the worker Jose Martinez Paz Flores in the past years. We think that there's still need to come up with a more comprehensive process to avoid Boston Police Department cooperate with ICE. This situation continue putting in fear from retaliation all the hard workers out there in the community. I also want to point out that the Tata construction is currently under investigation by the DOL for the retaliation they believe can also be used to help bad employers use this kind of illegal tactics to avoid their responsibility and ruin the lives of workers out there in the community. We have here members of the community and the worker centers, and one of them says how we can come up to the police department to tell about any situation, criminal situation, if they treat us as illegal. We're not illegal. We are people without documents, but why put that, the stamp of illegal people in the community? So the fear is there, is arising. The threats are arising. So I'm here also just to go over for what you just heard. And in Mascot, we believe that the workers should, and in our community, the workers should work, go out to work, come back safe to home, to their families, and have a dignity life. And immigrants, we're here, and and we're here to stay. Thank you so much for everything.
Very good. Thank you for your testimony. Michael Felson. Good to see you, Mike.
Hello, I'm Michael Felson. Thanks for this opportunity. I'm a, 4-decade resident of Jamaica Plain, and I also, for 39 years, worked for the U.S. Department of Labor right over there as an attorney engaged in enforcement of worker protection laws. So I'd like to just sort of elaborate on some of the worker protection issues that the Boston Trust Act implicates. As I'm sure you know, immigrant workers, whether documented or undocumented, are entitled to the protections of the law, whether it's the right to be paid according to the legal requirements like minimum wage and overtime, the right to a safe and healthy workplace, the right to workers' comp, or the right to assert a claim for those protections without fear of retaliation. The protections have no teeth, however, if workers are afraid to assert them. Employees, whether documented or undocumented, may have reason to fear negative repercussions from their employer if they assert their workplace rights or complain to government authorities. But immigrant workers without proper documentation of work authorization are particularly vulnerable to intimidation by unscrupulous employers who too often make threats that if the worker doesn't toe the line, ICE will be called. Employers who make threats like that do so that they can maintain substandard illegal work conditions. That hurts all workers, documented or undocumented. Employer threats to call ICE are also illegal retaliation under a number of laws. If an employer calls ICE in response to a worker's assertion of his rights, ICE should not participate in and thereby promote that employer's unlawful act. This body, of course, has no jurisdiction over ICE, but whatever version of the Boston Trust Act is adopted, it should ensure that no Boston governmental entity will assist in employers' threats and retaliation against workers by in any way coordinating or collaborating with ICE in response to the employer's unlawful attempts to use immigration status as a club against workers. In sum, we need to be sure that the City of Boston in no way facilitates or participates in unlawful employer intimidation of or retaliation against workers, whether documented or undocumented. Let's remember that all workers suffer when employers try to use ICE or any other governmental entity to stifle the workplace rights of undocumented workers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Diego Lowe, Roxana Rivera.
Good morning, Councilman Flaherty and other council people. Thank you very much for hearing us and for taking the challenge that faces our community seriously and trying to find responses for it. I want to address myself to a very specific piece of and ask you to seriously consider including in the Trust Act something that would directly impede referrals to ICE of the issues of documentation that come up in the course of employment, which is to say documents submitted to an employer for the purposes of work not be, it seems to me they shouldn't be a criminal matter of interest to the City of Boston regardless, but particularly that there not be referrals around those issues. And I want to, the impact of that particular piece is that in particular, I mean, with increasing frequency, people who might have been working off the books are being moved onto the books in this political climate. And employers who are asking folks to come in with whatever document they can come up with. That piece of paper that folks bring in is, if we care to see it that way, proof of criminal conduct. And that gives those employers then a very powerful tool for silencing workers who want to talk about sexual harassment on the job, who are injured and want to file a claim for comp, or who are not getting paid their overtime or whatever else. That is an issue which faces, I think, the huge majority of undocumented families in this city, either if it's not one adult, maybe it's a family member. So I think if we really want there to be a sense that one can interact safely with police, we have to understand that this will just completely undermine any confidence that families can be safe. The Mississippi raids that just happened a month or so ago, where more than 600 folks were detained, none of the employers have been charged. Are one way of sensing how polemic and complicated this issue may be, and I would seriously ask that you contemplate putting protections into the Trust Act. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Diego. Roxanne?
My name is Roxana Rivera, and I'm Vice President of SEIU 32BJ. We are one of the largest majority immigrant unions in the country. Amending the Trust Act that is very important to our membership. And Boston depends on immigrant friends and neighbors. And often we forget that these are the hardworking men and women that keep our office buildings clean, our universities, our airports, who actually care for our loved ones, who serve us at restaurants, but also those that sit next to us in college classes, that run small businesses. And that's why I'm in favor of making sure that we can make our Trust Act even stronger. We owe it to the immigrants of our communities to protect them so that we can all thrive together. All residents of Boston deserve to participate in our civic and economic life without facing threats to their civil liberties and safety. Since this bill was signed into law, we've seen a president come into office who runs his administration on hate and fear. So it's even more important now more than ever during these what we see as dark times, as our Black, brown, and immigrant friends and neighbors are facing relentless attacks by this hostile administration. This fear is high among the workers that we represent in this moment in time, especially those with temporary protective status. As you know, there's thousands of immigrant families here in Massachusetts and in Boston that will be facing losing their status come January if there is no other intervention at the federal level, even though they've been here for decades. Hundreds of those folks are workers represented by our union, and they've been coming to us with a high level of fear about what's going to happen to themselves and their families. And not only fear, but actually we've seen a high depression, and not only depression of parents, but also the kids. I think this will have compounding effects on how our city runs, from schools to work life to city life. This fear is even stronger among the undocumented immigrants currently who call Commonwealth their home. So we need our immigrant communities to be able to trust local police, and that local police actually need the community trust in order to keep our city safe. But this can't happen if our city police continue to cooperate with ICE in ways that, we've earlier folks that have testified have spoken to how we can strengthen our Trust Act to avoid that. So I ask that you do take all the considerations of folks that have come here today and the changes the amendments we'd like to see in order to make the Trust Act stronger. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxana. This council has always supported SEIU 32BJ, and some of the new members may forget this council goes back to when it was 615 supporting SEIU 615 before they became 32BJ. Anyone else wishing to offer public testimony may do so now or forever hold your peace. You have that microphone, and just please state your name and any affiliation for the record.
Sure, and sorry for not
very welcome.
indicating yes.
That's okay.
My name is Anna Leslie. I'm the director of the Austin Brighton Health Collaborative. Thank you, councilors. Councilor Zakem, we went to high school together, so go Knights, you've done us proud. I actually just wanted to bring up a specific issue. I was speaking with an officer recently on a separate matter. We're just going over scenarios around parking violations and moving violations, that kind of thing. And was talking about how, under what circumstances somebody would be brought back to the precinct, what would happen, communications with ICE, that sort of thing. And the sense I got at some point even brought up the Trust Act to him, and he said, "What's the Trust Act?" And so we looked it up together as we were on the phone, and he said, "Whoa, they don't tell us anything." So to the extent that that's true, and we were having a casual conversation, I was very concerned. We did talk about, bringing somebody back for a moving violation. If there is a warrant out, that they would call ICE and let them know they have this person, and then it's up to ICE whether or not they want to come and get that person. My understanding is that they are not legally required to call ICE. They have the option to do so, and that they are not legally allowed to hold that person. People in this room can very much correct me. I'm not a scholar on this at all. That's my understanding, and spoke with somebody after the fact to confirm that. I am not confident that that precinct knows that. And so my general concern is that how is information getting back to the people doing the daily job and entrusted to build that trust? And it's one thing to have a panel of people in an office declaring that that trust is being built, but if people on the ground don't know that, that's where the trust breaks down. And that person might be brought to the precinct and that is ironed out and they are released, but that fear and that trauma has been created. That's why my organization is a part of this conversation, because we are focused on public health, and the fear and the trauma and the mental health implications of these circumstances are severely detrimental to all of us. And so to the extent that this can be built into the Trust Act, that there is mandatory conversation and training within the precincts of how these laws come into play in a daily basis in interactions, what you are and are not allowed to do, would be, I think, hugely effective. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else wishing to offer public testimony? This will conclude the public testimony portion, and turn it over to colleagues for sort of last minute comments. Let's start with the lead sponsor, City Councilor Josh Zakem.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to everyone who participated in this, either by being here to show your support and your presence, by sharing your stories, by sharing your suggestions for how to make this a better act. I will say this, as it often is, our public testimony period is a reminder of what's at stake outside sort of the academic discussions, the legal discussions that we often have in this building and in other legislative chambers, I think, around the country. We absolutely need to be reflecting on what our character is, what the character of our city is and our state. We are in trying times for a host of reasons, but particularly around issues of immigration, around racism, around hatred, around things that sadly we cannot fix alone in this chamber, but it is on us as elected officials, as residents, as people here in the city of Boston to do everything we can. So I want to reiterate that the suggestions and comments we've received are certainly going to be well taken and have been well explained, I think, through this, both from Laura's formal segment as well as the public testimony. Look forward to working with my colleagues on the council, with many of you, with the administration, to make sure this does serve the purposes we talk about and continues to be an example, not just across the Commonwealth, but around the country of what should be happening in cities and towns, because this is a period of time I think many of us will look back on in decades to come and try and ask ourselves what we were doing when our neighbors were being persecuted, when our neighbors were being arrested, when their citizenship and their status was in question. So it's very much top of mind for me, and I know many of my colleagues, and I want to just thank you for that. I want to thank the chairman for his cooperation. I believe you were chairman of this committee also when we passed the original Trust Act, and we will continue to work together to make it the strongest it can be. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Zakem. Chair recognizes City Councilor Anissa Asabi-George.
Thank you again to both of you and to everyone who stayed, especially for public testimony. I think for me, identifying the ways that we need to fix and strengthen and reaffirm, but I think to Anna Leslie's point just now, inform and educate, not just our residents across the city, but to the practitioners that are doing this work. It's really important. So for me, those are the takeaways from today, and will really lead me and guide me in the work that I'll follow along with the leadership, certainly of the chair and of the lead sponsor. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. Chair recognizes City Councilor Lydia Edwards. Welcome.
I apologize for being late today. I had a conflict, but I think you know where my heart lies, and I'm very very encouraged by the amount of folks who are here today expressing not only that you want to make sure that immigrants have a voice, have a place, and feel protected in Boston, but that when we go as a body to actually implement policy, it meets the true spirit of the policy, not just trying to make sure that we balance or just basically trying to just push out policy for the sake of policy. I am incredibly encouraged, and I look to your guidance, and I have received your letter, and I am deeply also concerned about the loopholes that could be constructed from the current language in the proposed amendments. I look forward to tightening them up and making sure that the Trust Act really does engender trust in all aspects of our community. And also, I really do want to look to the workers' rights advocates and the worker centers and those of us who've been in the front lines in many cases. You know, I think it should be a red flag to any law enforcement officer when a person is trying to get their wages, is in the middle of a workers' comp case, is in the middle of trying to enforce some sort of right, that all of a sudden their immigration status matters to the employer. And that should be a red flag, and this Trust Act should also acknowledge that, whether it's in domestic violence, whether it's for workers' rights, when someone is trying to pursue their rights, if only at that point law enforcement is concerned about whether they are here legally or not, then that should be a red flag, and that should be a concern about how they're actually being exploited and that they're not the ones who are perpetrators of any crime, they're actually victims. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards, and thank my colleagues for being here, particularly Councilor Zachem as the lead sponsor. Thank the administration, the Boston Police Department, ACLU, the attorneys that we heard from, the organizations, the unions, and the citizens for taking time to be here and to participate. And with respect to Docket 0975, an ordinance amending the Trust Act, the Committee on Government Operations will be adjourned. Thank you.